The little boy's voice barely rose above the howl of the winter wind, but it stopped the cowboy dead in his tracks as surely as if someone had fired a gun beside his ear, because there was something in that whisper, something broken and desperate, that didn't belong out here in the frozen stretch of mountains where even grown men avoided traveling alone, and when the cowboy turned, his boots crunching against the snow, he saw them standing just beyond the tree line, a boy no older than 7. Thin as a fence rail, his cheeks red with cold, and behind him a woman slumped against a fallen log, her head bowed, her dark hair tangled and frosted at the ends, and the boy swallowed hard before whispering again, "Mama can't walk anymore," as if saying it louder might make it real, and the cowboy felt a slow, heavy tightening in his chest because he'd heard that tone before, not from strangers, but from his own memories, buried deep under years of silence and dust, memories of a time when he, too, had stood helpless beside someone he loved, praying for a miracle that never came, and for a long second he just stared, his breath fogging the air, the weight of the world pressing down on him, because helping them would mean changing everything, and he had built his life around not letting anything change ever again, not since the night his cabin became a place of ghosts instead of warmth, not since grief had taught him that caring was just another word for pain, but the boy's eyes, wide, frightened, stubborn, refused to let him turn away, and before he could stop himself, the cowboy lowered himself to one knee, his voice rough but steady as he asked the boy his name, and when the child said Eli, clutching his coat with fingers that trembled from cold and fear, the cowboy nodded slowly, then stood and walked toward the woman, whose skin was pale and clammy beneath his gloved hand, her breath shallow, her leg twisted at an angle that told a painful story of a fall gone wrong. And the cowboy cursed under his breath, not at her, not at the boy, but at the mountain, at fate, at himself for pretending he could live out here untouched by other people's suffering, because winter didn't forgive mistakes and neither did the past, and he knew that if he left them, they wouldn't last the night, not with the storm rolling in and the temperature already sinking fast. So he made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, bending down and lifting the woman into his arms. As if she weighed nothing, though the burden he felt had nothing to do with her body, and when Eli gasped and asked if his mama would be okay, the cowboy met the boy's eyes and said the only honest thing he could, "She will be if we move now," and with that, he turned toward the narrow trail leading back to his cabin, each step heavy, the wind biting into his face, memories clawing their way back with every breath. Because the last time he had carried someone through the snow, he had arrived too late, and the cabin waiting ahead loomed in his mind like a test he had never wanted to take again, and Eli followed close behind, his small boots slipping, his faith resting entirely on a stranger who hadn't asked for this but couldn't walk away, and when they finally reached the cabin, its lights dark, smoke long absent from the chimney, the cowboy kicked the door open with his boot and carried the woman inside, laying her gently on the old bed by the fire, his hands moving automatically. As he built a flame, the warmth slowly pushing back the cold, while Eli hovered nearby, whispering to his mother, brushing her hair from her face, and the cowboy watched them from across the room, something breaking loose inside him as he realized how long it had been since another human presence had filled this space, since laughter, or fear, or hope had dared to cross his threshold, and as the fire crackled to life, the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open just long enough to meet his, and in that fleeting moment, he saw gratitude, pain, and a quiet strength that mirrored his own, and she whispered, "Thank you," before slipping back into unconsciousness, and the cowboy turned away quickly, swallowing hard, because gratitude had a way of undoing him, and later, as night settled over the mountain and the storm finally broke, snow pounding against the cabin walls like a warning, Eli sat at the table sipping warm broth, his hands finally steady, and looked up at the cowboy with a question too big for words, and the cowboy realized that by opening his door to them, he had opened something inside himself that he had kept locked for years, and whatever happened next, whatever this storm brought, there was no going back to the quiet loneliness he had once mistaken for peace, because somewhere between a whispered plea and a child's trust, his life had changed forever, and as the fire burned brighter against the dark, the cowboy made a silent promise to the boy, to the woman, and to himself. This time, he would not run from what needed him. The storm raged through the night like it had something personal to settle, the wind screaming against the cabin walls while snow piled high enough to bury the windows, but inside, time slowed to the rhythm of the fire and the shallow breaths of the woman on the bed, and the cowboy didn't sleep, not even when exhaustion weighed on his bones. Because every crackle of the flames reminded him of another night years ago when he had sat helpless beside a woman he loved, watching life slip away while the world outside carried on without mercy, and now history stood before him again, daring him to either face it or flee, and when the woman's fever spiked near dawn, her body shaking violently, the cowboy moved without hesitation, cooling her skin, forcing sips of water between her lips, whispering steady reassurances even though fear gnawed at him from the inside, because Eli sat nearby clutching a worn blanket, his eyes never leaving his mother's face, and the cowboy refused to let that boy learn the same lesson he once had, that sometimes help comes too late. So when morning finally broke through the storm, pale and fragile, the woman stirred again, her eyes clearer this time, and she asked in a hoarse whisper where they were, and when the cowboy told her she was safe, that she and her son could stay as long as needed, she cried quietly, not loud sobs but the kind that come from a soul that has been carrying too much alone. And as she told him her name, Sarah, and how they had been traveling toward a town miles away when her horse slipped and fell, breaking her leg and leaving them stranded, the cowboy listened in silence, because every word echoed with resilience, with the kind of strength that doesn't shout but endures, and days passed as the snow slowly eased its grip on the mountain, and the cabin transformed from a lonely shelter into something alive again, filled with small sounds the cowboy hadn't realized he missed. The scrape of a chair, the soft laughter of a child, the murmured conversations that warmed the air more than the fire ever could, and Eli followed the cowboy everywhere, asking questions, mimicking his movements, calling him sir at first before shyly switching to cowboy, and when Sarah was finally strong enough to sit by the window, watching the snow melt into streams that glittered in the sunlight, she thanked him again, but this time he didn't turn away, because he understood now that gratitude wasn't a weakness, it was a bridge. And one afternoon, as the cowboy taught Eli how to split kindling, the boy suddenly asked, "Did you lose someone too?" And the question struck deeper than any blade, but instead of shutting down, the cowboy nodded, his voice low as he spoke of a wife lost to illness years before, of a cabin that became a tomb of memories, and Eli listened with a seriousness far beyond his years before saying simply, "Mama says broken things can still be strong," and in that moment, the cowboy felt something inside him finally loosen, like ice breaking after a long winter, and when the snow cleared enough for travel, the cowboy prepared the horses, expecting gratitude and goodbye, expecting to return to his solitude, but when Sarah stood at the cabin door, leaning on a makeshift crutch, she hesitated, then asked softly, "What if we didn't leave right away?" And the cowboy didn't answer immediately, because this choice mattered more than any he'd made in years, but as he looked at Eli laughing near the fence, at the firelight flickering through the cabin window, at the place that had stopped feeling like a grave and started feeling like home, he realized that saving them hadn't been about heroism, it had been about healing, for all of them, and he nodded, and seasons turned as winter surrendered to spring, and the mountain bloomed with wildflowers, and the cabin echoed with life again, not perfect, not easy, but real, and one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky gold, Eli leaned against the cowboy's side and whispered, "I'm glad you heard me that day," and the cowboy swallowed hard, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, knowing that some moments change everything not because of what we say, but because we choose to listen, and if this story touched you, if you believe that kindness still matters, that broken hearts can still find their way home, then don't walk away quietly, subscribe to this channel, because stories like this remind us who we are, and every time you return, you help keep these stories alive, one whisper, one choice, one rescued moment at a time.